March 15, 1943, somewhere over the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Akira Yamamoto banked his Zero fighter hard to port, chasing what should have been an easy kill. The American plane ahead had made a critical mistake, entering a turning dogfight where Japanese fighters had dominated for 18 months of brutal Pacific combat. Yamamoto had shot down 7 American aircraft since Pearl Harbor, his white scarf marking him as one of the elite pilots who had humbled American air power from the Philippines to Guadalcanal. He pushed his throttle forward, confident that within seconds his guns would find their mark and another American would join the dozens already sent spiraling into the ocean below. Then the American pilot did something impossible. The enemy fighter, which intelligence reports had dismissed as another clumsy American design built by a nation that understood mass production but not aeronautical elegance, suddenly rolled inverted and dove vertically at a speed that made Yamamoto's eyes widen in disbelief. His Zero, light and maneuverable, the aircraft that had earned Japan air superiority across half the Pacific, simply could not follow. The American plane accelerated away as if tied to a rocket, pulling out of the dive thousands of feet below with casual ease that suggested power reserves Yamamoto had never encountered. He watched helplessly as the distinctive bent-wing silhouette leveled off, climbed back toward his altitude with terrifying speed, and then, in a maneuver that violated everything Yamamoto understood about aerial combat, the American turned the tables completely. Within 2 minutes, Yamamoto found himself desperately trying to evade an enemy he had considered prey, his Zero twisting through the sky in maneuvers that would have defeated any American fighter he had previously encountered, but which now seemed pathetically inadequate against this new predator that combined speed, power, and firepower in proportions Japanese intelligence had insisted Americans could never achieve. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pattern of contempt and misunderstanding that would cost Japan thousands of pilots and ultimately control of Pacific skies had begun years before the first Corsair ever entered combat. Japanese naval aviation in the late 1930s represented the pinnacle of a carefully cultivated doctrine that prioritized maneuverability, range, and pilot skill above all other considerations. The philosophy was elegant and had proven devastatingly effective in the skies over China, where Japanese fighters had dominated Chinese resistance with ease that reinforced every assumption about the superiority of Japanese aviation doctrine. Japanese aircraft designers, working under severe constraints imposed by Japan's limited industrial capacity and access to strategic materials, had created fighters that achieved remarkable performance through ruthless weight reduction. Every unnecessary pound was eliminated. Armor protection for pilots was minimal or non-existent, dismissed as unnecessary weight that reduced maneuverability and range. Self-sealing fuel tanks, which added significant weight but could prevent catastrophic fires when hit by enemy bullets, were rejected for the same reason. The cockpit canopy on the Zero was designed to slide open, allowing the pilot to bail out more easily. But this meant it couldn't be armored without adding weight that designers refused to accept. The result was an aircraft that could outturn anything in the sky, that possessed range sufficient to escort bombers on missions of extraordinary distance, and that, in the hands of Japan's superbly trained pilots, had proven nearly invincible in combat from 1937 through 1942. The Imperial Japanese Navy's pilot training program before the war was perhaps the most rigorous and selective in the world, producing aviators whose skill level was genuinely extraordinary by any objective standard. Candidates for naval aviation underwent years of training that eliminated more than 90% of applicants. Those who survived learned not just to fly, but to fly with a precision and situational awareness that Western pilots rarely achieved. Japanese naval aviators practiced formation flying until they could maintain position in weather conditions that would ground Western squadrons. They trained in navigation over open ocean until they could find their carriers after missions of hundreds of miles without radio guidance. They drilled in gunnery until their accuracy rates exceeded anything American or British pilots achieved in peacetime training. The veterans who attacked Pearl Harbor, who sank Prince of Wales and Repulse, who dominated the skies over the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, represented the cream of this system. Pilots with thousands of hours of flight time and combat experience in China that had honed their skills to a razor's edge. This combination of superior aircraft and superior pilots had produced victory after victory in the war's opening months, reinforcing Japanese confidence that their aviation doctrine was fundamentally sound and that American aviation technology and training were inferior. When American fighters attempted to dogfight with Zeros in late 1941 and early 1942, the results were predictably disastrous for the Americans. Brewster Buffaloes, obsolete aircraft that should never have been sent into combat against front-line Japanese fighters, were massacred. Grumman Wildcats, more capable but still outturned by Zeros, suffered terrible losses whenever their pilots allowed themselves to be drawn into turning fights. American bomber formations without fighter escort were slaughtered, shot down in such numbers that daylight bombing missions became virtual suicide runs. The statistics from the first 6 months of war seem to validate every Japanese assumption about aerial combat. Japanese fighters were shooting down American aircraft at ratios that sometimes exceeded 10-1. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros reported with something approaching awe the maneuverability and performance of the Japanese fighters. Japanese pilots, reading intelligence summaries of American pilot reports, concluded with satisfaction that American morale was broken and that American aviation technology was exactly as inferior as pre-war assessments had predicted. American intelligence agencies, analyzing the wreckage of shot-down Zeros and interrogating captured Japanese pilots, reached conclusions that should have terrified Japanese planners, but instead were dismissed with contempt when Japanese intelligence officers read translated American assessments. American analysts correctly identified that Japanese aircraft achieved their remarkable performance through extreme weight reduction, and that this came at the cost of protection for the pilot and critical systems.
They noted with professional interest that Japanese pilots were extraordinarily skilled, but that Japan's training pipeline was producing pilots at a rate far lower than American training programs, which were rapidly expanding to produce thousands of new aviators. They observed the Japanese aircraft engines, while well-designed, were reaching the limits of their development potential, and that American engines were being developed with substantially greater power output that would enable new generations of fighters with performance characteristics Japanese aircraft could not match. Most critically, American tactical analysts concluded that the solution to Japanese fighter superiority lay not in attempting to match Japanese maneuverability, which American industrial practices and safety requirements made impractical, but in developing fighters that could exploit advantages in speed, diving performance, and firepower, while refusing to engage in the turning dogfights where Zeros excelled. Japanese intelligence officers reading translated versions of these American assessments in mid-1942 drew exactly the wrong conclusions. American recognition that Japanese aircraft were superior was interpreted as evidence that American aviation technology was fundamentally inferior and would remain so. American emphasis on speed and diving attacks rather than maneuverability was seen as admission that American pilots lacked the skill for true aerial combat. American focus on pilot protection through armor and self-sealing fuel tanks was dismissed as evidence that American pilots were cowards who needed to be coddled, unlike Japanese aviators who accepted death as a natural consequence of combat service. The massive expansion of American pilot training programs was noted, but discounted because Japanese doctrine held that pilot quality mattered far more than pilot quantity, and that hastily trained American pilots could never match the skill of Japanese aviators. These assessments, based on accurate observation but catastrophically wrong interpretation, would shape Japanese responses to American aircraft development and doom thousands of Japanese pilots who flew into combat against enemies their commanders insisted could not exist. The aircraft that would shatter these illusions was already under development when Japanese intelligence officers were writing their dismissive assessments of American aviation capabilities. The Vought F-4U Corsair originated from a 1938 United States Navy requirement for a carrier-based fighter that could exceed 400 miles per hour, a speed that seemed almost fantastical given that contemporary carrier fighters barely exceeded 300 miles per hour. Vought's design team, led by Rex Beisel, approached the requirement with an audacity that reflected American industrial confidence and a willingness to solve engineering problems through brute force application of power and innovative design. The solution was to mount the most powerful aircraft engine then available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower in the smallest and most aerodynamically efficient airframe that could accommodate it. The resulting aircraft was unlike anything flying in 1940, a fighter that combined speed, climb rate, and firepower in proportions that exceeded not just existing fighters, but the theoretical capabilities that most aeronautical engineers believed possible for carrier-based aircraft.
The design challenges were substantial and required innovations that pushed American aviation technology in new directions. The R2800 engine was enormous, with a diameter that would create unacceptable drag if mounted in a conventional fighter fuselage. Beisel's solution was the inverted gull wing, a design that allowed the landing gear to be shorter and lighter while positioning the propeller at the optimal height above the deck and reducing the drag penalty from the massive engine. The bent wing configuration would become the Corsair's most distinctive visual characteristic, making it instantly recognizable and giving it a predatory appearance that matched its lethal capabilities. The propeller itself presented challenges, as the engine's enormous power required a propeller of unprecedented size to absorb it efficiently. The solution was a 13-foot diameter propeller, the largest ever fitted to a single-engine fighter, which required the distinctive inverted gull wing configuration to provide adequate ground clearance. The cockpit was positioned far back on the fuselage to maintain the aircraft's center of gravity, giving the pilot excellent visibility forward and above, but limited visibility during carrier approaches, a design compromise that would delay the Corsair's carrier deployment and ironically give Marine Corps pilots in the Solomon Islands the opportunity to prove its capabilities in land-based operations. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The armament represented another quantum leap beyond existing fighter capabilities, where the Zero mounted two 20mm cannons and two rifle-caliber machine guns, and the Wildcat carried 6 50-caliber machine guns. The Corsair was designed to carry 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, giving it a total of 2,400 rounds of ammunition and a weight of fire that could saw enemy aircraft in half or reduce them to flaming wreckage in seconds. Later variants would replace the outboard machine guns with 20mm cannons, further increasing firepower. The Corsair could also carry bombs or rockets on underwing pylons, making it effective in ground attack roles that Japanese fighters, designed purely for air-to-air combat, could not perform. This versatility reflected American doctrine that emphasized multi-role capabilities and operational flexibility, rather than the narrow specialization that characterized Japanese aircraft design. The first prototype flew on May 29, 1940, and immediately demonstrated performance that exceeded specifications and expectations. The Corsair achieved 417 miles per hour in level flight, making it the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour. The climb rate was extraordinary, reaching 20,000 feet in under 8 minutes, performance that would allow Corsair pilots to gain altitude advantage over enemy fighters with ease. The diving speed exceeded 500 miles per hour, faster than many aircraft could achieve in level flight, giving Corsair pilots the ability to disengage from unfavorable combat situations at will. The range, with external fuel tanks, exceeded 1,000 miles, sufficient for escort missions and offensive sweeps deep into enemy-held territory. Every performance metric exceeded the capabilities of existing fighters by margins that suggested the Corsair represented not an incremental improvement, but a generational leap in fighter technology.
Production delays and teething problems typical of revolutionary aircraft designs meant that the Corsair did not reach combat squadrons until late 1942, and initial deployments revealed problems that required months to resolve. The long nose and rearward cockpit position that optimized the aircraft's aerodynamics made carrier landings difficult, particularly for inexperienced pilots. The landing gear was stiff and prone to bouncing on touchdown, creating the risk of the aircraft porpoising down the deck. The engine had a tendency to cut out during the sharp turns required for carrier approaches. These problems, which would eventually be solved through design modifications and improved pilot training, led the Navy to initially restrict Corsair operations to land-based squadrons, while Wildcats and the new Grumman Hellcats continued to operate from carriers. This decision, made for sound safety reasons, inadvertently gave Marine Corps squadrons operating from primitive airfields in the Solomon Islands the opportunity to prove the Corsair's capabilities in the crucible of daily combat against Japan's best pilots flying Japan's best aircraft. Marine Fighting Squadron 124, VMF 124, received the first Corsairs to reach combat theaters in February 1943, deploying to Guadalcanal, where American and Japanese forces had been locked in brutal combat for control of Henderson Field and the surrounding jungle since August 1942. The squadron was commanded by Major William Gassis, a veteran pilot who had survived the opening months of the war flying Wildcats and who understood intimately the capabilities of Japanese fighters and the limitations of existing American aircraft. His pilots were a mix of combat veterans exhausted from months of continuous operations and new arrivals, fresh from training in the United States, who had never seen combat. The Corsairs they received were revolutionary aircraft that none of them had flown before February 1943, powerful and fast, but unfamiliar and requiring entirely new tactics that contradicted everything they had learned about fighter combat in Wildcats. Among the new pilots was Second Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a farm girl from Iowa who had learned to fly crop dusters before the war and who had talked her way into the Marine Corps aviation program through a combination of genuine skill, relentless determination, and fortuitous timing that placed her application before a recruiter who was willing to overlook regulations that technically barred women from combat aviation roles. Mitchell was 22 years old, stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, and weighed 115 pounds, dimensions that made her ideally suited for the cramped cockpit of a fighter aircraft, but which had convinced multiple training officers that she lacked the physical strength for combat flying. She had proven them wrong through every stage of training, graduating near the top of her class in flight school and demonstrating in countless training exercises that she possessed the situational awareness, quick reactions, and aggressive mindset that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. Her squadron mates had initially treated her with skepticism that ranged from polite doubt to open hostility, but her flying skills and her refusal to complain about the primitive conditions on Guadalcanal had gradually earned their respect, if not yet their full acceptance. The island itself was a nightmare of mud, disease, and exhaustion, where pilots flew multiple combat missions daily, lived in tents, ate monotonous rations, and endured Japanese bombing raids that came with depressing regularity. Henderson Field was a strip of pierced steel planking laid over dirt that turned to soup in the frequent tropical rains. Aircraft maintenance was performed in the open under conditions that would have scandalized stateside mechanics, with spare parts scavenged from wrecked aircraft and repairs improvised with whatever materials could be found or stolen. Pilots slept when they could, flew when ordered, and died with sufficient regularity that nobody bothered to unpack the belongings of replacement pilots until they had survived their first week. The life expectancy of a fighter pilot on Guadalcanal in early 1943 was measured in weeks, not months, and everyone knew it. Japanese bombers came down from Rabaul almost daily, escorted by Zeros flown by veterans whose skill and experience gave them advantages that American pilots could overcome only through numerical superiority and tactical coordination that often broke down in the chaos of combat. Mitchell's first combat mission in a Corsair came on March 14, 1943, a routine patrol over the Solomon Islands that was supposed to be a gentle introduction to combat operations, but which turned into a furious dogfight when her four-plane division encountered a Japanese patrol of 6 Zeros at 18,000 feet over the water between Guadalcanal and New Georgia. The division leader, Captain James Bradley, was a veteran with 11 confirmed kills who had survived 8 months of combat through a combination of skill, caution, and luck that he knew could not last forever. He had emphasized in the briefing that morning that Corsair pilots must never attempt to turn with Zeros, that their advantages lay in speed and diving attacks, that engagement meant hitting hard and either killing the target or disengaging to set up another attack, never lingering in a turning fight where the Zero's superior maneuverability would prove decisive. Mitchell had listened carefully, understanding intellectually what Bradley meant, but not yet comprehending emotionally what it meant to see an enemy fighter in her gun sight, to press the trigger and watch tracers stream toward another human being, to kill or be killed in a contest where hesitation meant death. The engagement began when Bradley spotted the Japanese formation crossing below them at 12,000 feet, heading northwest toward Rabaul after what had probably been a reconnaissance mission over American positions. Bradley led his division into a diving attack that accelerated the Corsairs to speeds the Zeros could not match, coming down out of the sun in a textbook approach that gave the Japanese pilots only seconds of warning before the Americans were among them. Bradley's first burst caught a Zero squarely, the concentrated fire from 6 50-caliber machine guns striking with devastating effect that tore pieces from the lightweight fighter and sent it spinning toward the ocean, trailing smoke. His wingman scored hits on another Zero that rolled away, trailing fuel. Then the formation dissolved into the chaos that characterized all aerial combat, individual duels between aircraft scattered across miles of sky where success depended on split-second decisions made at speeds and in conditions that left no time for reflection or doubt. Mitchell found herself alone, separated from her division mates in the wild maneuvering that followed the initial attack, searching frantically for enemies while trying to remember everything she had been taught about checking her six, maintaining airspeed, keeping the sun at her back.
She spotted a Zero below her, climbing toward altitude after evading another Corsair, the Japanese pilot apparently unaware of her presence. She rolled inverted and dove, the Corsair accelerating with a power that still amazed her even after 2 weeks of training flights. The airspeed indicator climbing past 300 miles per hour, past 350, past 400 as she plummeted toward the enemy fighter. She pulled out of the dive 1,000 feet behind the Zero and slightly below, exactly as taught, hauled back on the stick to bring her nose up and squeezed the trigger as her gun sight crossed the enemy aircraft. The Corsair shuddered as all 6 guns fired, the tracers walking across the sky toward the target in a stream that seemed impossibly slow, despite traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. She missed. Her burst passed behind the Zero as her target turned, Mitchell's inexperience showing in her failure to lead the target correctly. The Japanese pilot, now fully aware of her presence, rolled his Zero into a hard right turn that Mitchell knew she could not follow without losing every advantage her aircraft possessed. She firewalled the throttle and extended straight ahead, the Corsair's massive engine pulling her away from the Zero with contemptuous ease. She climbed, gaining altitude while the Zero followed futilely, unable to match the Corsair's climb rate. At 20,000 feet, she rolled over and looked back to find her pursuer had given up the chase and was diving back toward the furball below, where other aircraft were still dueling. She took a deep breath, realized her hands were shaking, and forced herself to breathe slowly while she searched the sky for threats and opportunities. Below her, the dogfight continued with desperate intensity as the remaining aircraft twisted through the sky in a deadly ballet that followed no choreography except survival. She could see 2 aircraft locked in a turning fight, spiraling down toward the ocean in ever-tightening circles that would end only when one pilot made a fatal mistake or ran out of airspace. Another aircraft, she could not tell if it was American or Japanese from this altitude, was trailing smoke and losing altitude in a controlled glide toward the water. A parachute blossomed white against the blue ocean, marking where another pilot, friend or enemy unknown, had abandoned his dying aircraft and was now drifting down to an uncertain fate in the shark-infested waters below. Mitchell forced herself to focus on the tactical situation rather than the human drama playing out beneath her. She had altitude, she had airspeed, she had surprise. These were the advantages Bradley had told her to exploit, the holy trinity of fighter combat that could overcome enemy skill and superior maneuverability if used correctly. She spotted another Zero, this one pulling up from an attack on a Corsair that was extending away at high speed, the Japanese pilot climbing to regain altitude and position for another attack. Mitchell rolled inverted again and dove, the Corsair responding to her controls with precision that still amazed her, the massive engine pulling her down out of the sky like a stone dropped from a tower. This time she compensated for her previous error, aiming not at where the Zero was, but where it would be when her bullets arrived, leading the target by what seemed an impossible amount, but which her training insisted was correct. She squeezed the trigger at 800 yards, holding it down as the range decreased, watching the tracers arc across the sky toward the climbing Zero. She saw pieces fly off the enemy fighter as her bullets found their mark, saw the Zero's canopy shatter, saw the aircraft snap into a violent roll that carried it over onto its back and then into a vertical dive that could only end in the ocean below. She did not watch it impact. She was already pulling up from her dive and searching for her next target or her next threat. The adrenaline surging through her system, sharpening her senses to supernatural clarity, while simultaneously making her hand shake so badly she could barely hold the stick steady. She had just killed another human being, someone's son or husband or father, and she felt nothing except savage satisfaction that she had gotten him before he got her or one of her squadron mates. The fight ended as abruptly as it had begun when the surviving Japanese fighters, outnumbered and low on fuel after their long flight from Rabaul, broke off and ran for home at full throttle. The Americans, also low on fuel and widely scattered across dozens of miles of ocean, made no attempt to pursue. Mitchell joined up with Bradley and the other survivor from her division, flying formation back toward Guadalcanal while Bradley's voice crackled over the radio with terse praise for her first kill and equally terse criticism of her initial attack that had failed. She accepted both without comment, knowing that Bradley was right on both counts and that surviving long enough to become an ace meant learning from mistakes without dwelling on them. They landed at Henderson Field to find that one of their division mates had not returned, his Corsair last seen trailing smoke and losing altitude over water where rescue was unlikely. The squadron intelligence officer debriefed them efficiently, recording their claims and observations with professional detachment that made the previous hour's mortal combat seem like just another routine training exercise. Mitchell signed her combat report, claiming 1-0 destroyed, and walked back to her tent feeling simultaneously exhilarated and exhausted, understanding for the first time what combat veterans meant when they said that fighting was 99% boredom and 1% terror compressed into moments that felt like hours but lasted only minutes. Over the following weeks, as VMF 124 flew daily missions against Japanese aircraft operating from Rabaul and other bases in the northern Solomons, the pattern that would characterize Corsair operations throughout the Pacific War became clear. Japanese pilots, encountering Corsairs for the first time, attempted to engage them in the turning dogfights where Zeros had dominated American fighters for over a year. Corsair pilots, following doctrine developed through hard experience and bitter losses, refused to fight on Japanese terms. They exploited their advantages in speed, climb rate, and diving performance, attacking from altitude with devastating hit-and-run tactics that gave Japanese pilots no opportunity to employ their superior maneuverability. When Japanese fighters attempted to follow diving Corsairs, they found themselves left behind by aircraft that could exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive, while Zeros approaching 400 miles per hour faced structural failure as their lightweight airframes began to shed parts. When Japanese fighters attempted to climb after extending Corsairs, they found themselves outclimbed by aircraft whose massive engines produced power that Japanese pilots could not match. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound and strategically significant in ways that would take months to fully manifest.
Aviators who had flown with confidence, born of 18 months of aerial superiority, suddenly found themselves flying aircraft that seemed obsolete against this new American fighter that combined speed and power in proportions they had been assured Americans could not achieve. Japanese pilots began reporting encounters with Corsairs in terms that echoed American reports of zero encounters from 1942, describing an aircraft that could not be caught, could not be outclimbed, could not be escaped from once it committed to an attack. The bent-wing silhouette became associated with death as surely as the Zero's profile had once meant death for American pilots, and Japanese aviators learned to scan the sky above them constantly, knowing that Corsairs almost always attacked from altitude, and that once committed to their diving attack, they were nearly impossible to evade. The term "whistling death" emerged from Japanese pilot reports, describing the distinctive sound the Corsair made in a high-speed dive, a sound that became the last thing many Japanese pilots heard before American bullets tore their aircraft apart. Japanese intelligence officers, receiving reports of this new American fighter with performance characteristics that seemed to defy the assessments they had confidently made just months earlier, faced a choice between acknowledging their previous estimates had been catastrophically wrong or dismissing pilot reports as exaggerations made under combat stress. Institutional inertia and bureaucratic face-saving concerns pushed them toward the latter interpretation. Initial assessments of the Corsair acknowledged it was faster than previous American fighters, but insisted that Japanese pilots' superior training and the Zero's superior maneuverability remained decisive advantages. Reports that Corsairs could outclimb Zeros were dismissed as impossible given the known power-to-weight ratios of American engines and the assumed weight of American aircraft with their armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Claims that Corsairs could dive away from Zeros at will were attributed to pilot error or poor tactical positioning rather than fundamental performance differences. These assessments, distributed to operational units and used to develop tactical doctrine, assured Japanese pilots that with proper tactics, they could defeat Corsairs as they had defeated Wildcats, advice that would cost hundreds of lives as pilots discovered in combat that the tactics their commanders prescribed simply did not work against an aircraft whose performance exceeded what their intelligence services admitted was possible. By June 1943, VMF 124 had established a kill ratio against Japanese aircraft that exceeded 10-1, statistics that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier when Japanese fighters dominated Pacific skies. Mitchell had shot down 6 Japanese aircrafts by then, making her an ace and one of the squadron's most effective pilots, though her gender meant that her achievements received no publicity and would remain classified until decades after the war ended. She had learned through trial and error and watching other pilots die the hard lessons that separated survivors from casualties in aerial combat. She knew to never trust her mirrors alone, but to constantly turn her head searching for threats, knew to check her 6 o'clock position every few seconds no matter what else was happening, knew that altitude was life and that giving up altitude for any reason except a kill shot was usually fatal. She had learned to manage her fear, to function effectively while terrified, to make life or death decisions in fractions of a second while her conscious mind was still processing what her eyes were seeing. She had learned that killing became easier with practice, that the enemy aircraft in her gun sight stopped being a person and became a target to be destroyed, that the guilt and moral questions came later when she was alone in her tent, unable to sleep while her mind replayed today's combat over and over in exhausting detail. The strategic significance of the Corsair's deployment went far beyond individual pilot victories and squadron kill ratios, though those numbers told a story of shifting aerial superiority the Japanese planners should have recognized as catastrophic. The appearance of an American fighter that could not only match, but substantially exceed the capabilities of Japan's best aircraft represented a technological and industrial achievement that invalidated fundamental assumptions about American aviation capabilities.
Japanese doctrine had held that American aircraft were inferior and would remain inferior because American designers prioritized pilot comfort and safety over performance, because American industrial practices emphasized quantity over quality, because American pilots lacked the fighting spirit to fully exploit whatever capabilities their aircraft possessed. The Corsair proved every assumption wrong simultaneously. It was faster than any Japanese fighter, more heavily armed, more rugged, capable of absorbing battle damage that would destroy a Zero and still returning home. It was being produced in numbers that Japanese industry could not match, rolling off American assembly lines at rates of hundreds per month, while Japanese factories struggled to produce dozens of replacement Zeros. It was being flown by American pilots who were learning quickly from combat experience and who, contrary to Japanese assumptions about American morale, demonstrated increasing aggressiveness and tactical sophistication as the war progressed. The industrial implications should have terrified Japanese planners, who understood that wars were won by factories as much as by soldiers. America was producing the Corsair while simultaneously producing the Hellcat, another fighter with performance that exceeded Japanese aircraft, while also producing thousands of bombers, transport aircraft, and training planes that demonstrated industrial capacity Japan could not hope to match. American pilot training programs were graduating thousands of new aviators every month, pilots who, while perhaps not as individually skilled as Japanese veterans, nonetheless possessed adequate training and flew aircraft so superior that skill differentials became less decisive. Japanese training programs, constricted by fuel shortages, limited training aircraft, and doctrinal emphasis on quality over quantity, were producing replacement pilots at rates that could not keep pace with combat losses. Every veteran Japanese pilot killed in combat represented skills and experience that could not be replaced, while American pilots killed in combat were replaced within days by new arrivals, whose aircraft gave them better chances of survival than the veterans they replaced had possessed flying Wildcats a year earlier. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 illustrated how completely the balance of aerial power had shifted and how Japanese intelligence failures had contributed to a catastrophe from which Japanese naval aviation would never recover. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, sorted to engage American carrier task forces supporting the invasion of Saipan, with a plan that depended on Japanese aircraft having longer range than American fighters, and thus being able to attack American carriers from distances where American fighters could not reach Japanese carriers for counterstrikes. The plan assumed that Japanese pilots, even the partially trained replacements who now constituted the majority of carrier air groups, would prove more effective than American pilots in the massive aerial battle Ozawa anticipated. Neither assumption survived contact with reality. American carrier fighters, including Hellcats that shared the Corsair's powerful engine and many of its performance characteristics, intercepted Japanese strikes at ranges that should have been safe according to pre-war assessments of American fighter capabilities. The ensuing slaughter, which American pilots nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force in a single day of combat that killed over 600 Japanese aircrew while American losses numbered fewer than 30. Japanese pilots, many with less than a year of training compared to the 3 or 4 years veteran pilots had received before the war, flew obsolete aircraft against Americans flying technically superior fighters and supported by radar direction that gave them advance warning of every Japanese attack. The Zeros and other Japanese carrier aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies in 1942 proved helpless against Hellcats and Corsairs whose pilots could choose when and how to engage, attacking with speed and altitude advantages that made Japanese defensive maneuvers futile.
Japanese pilots who attempted the turning dogfights that had worked against Wildcats found themselves simply unable to force American fighters to turn with them, as Hellcat and Corsair pilots extended away at speeds Japanese aircraft could not match, climbed back to altitude, and set up another diving attack. Japanese pilots who attempted to flee found themselves run down by American fighters whose superior speed made escape impossible. The fundamental equation of aerial combat had reversed completely from what it had been in 1942, and Japanese pilots discovered that flying obsolete aircraft against technically superior enemies was exactly as hopeless as American pilots had found it in the war's opening months. Mitchell, who had transferred to a carrier-based squadron after her tour on Guadalcanal, flew in that battle from the deck of USS Essex, part of a combat air patrol that intercepted one of the Japanese strikes 50 miles from the American carriers. She shot down 3 Japanese aircraft that day, targets that seemed to her almost pathetically easy compared to the skilled veterans she had fought over the Solomons a year earlier. The Japanese pilots she encountered made elementary mistakes, flying in formations that were too loose for mutual support, failing to maintain adequate altitude, committing to attacks that left them vulnerable to counterattack. She recognized in their flying the same mistakes she had made in her first combats, errors that veteran pilots learned to avoid or died trying. And she understood that these were replacement pilots with inadequate training flying obsolete aircraft against enemies they had no realistic chance of defeating.
She killed them without hesitation or remorse, understanding that this was what she had been trained to do, and that their deaths brought the war one step closer to ending, but she felt none of the savage satisfaction she had experienced in her early combats. These were not the elite veterans who had terrorized American forces in 1942. These were barely trained teenagers flying aircraft that should never have been sent against American fighters, and their deaths were less victories than executions. The destruction of Japanese carrier aviation at the Philippine Sea represented a strategic catastrophe that Japanese intelligence services had failed to predict or adequately warn against, despite clear evidence that American aircraft were technologically superior and being produced in overwhelming numbers. Japanese planners had convinced themselves that pilot quality and fighting spirit could overcome American material advantages. The Japanese aviation doctrine remained superior even if American aircraft were faster and more heavily armed. The battle proved decisively that quality could not overcome quantity when the quantitative advantage was combined with technical superiority and adequate training. The 600 Japanese pilots killed on June 19, 1944, represented not just individual deaths, but the destruction of institutional knowledge and experience that could not be rebuilt. Japanese carrier aviation would never again pose a serious threat to American naval forces, and the remaining carriers, lacking trained pilots and adequate aircraft, would be reduced to decoys and targets in the final months of the war. By late 1944, as American forces advanced across the Pacific in a campaign that combined amphibious assaults with carrier strikes and submarine warfare into an integrated offensive that Japanese forces could not counter effectively, the Corsair had achieved a combat record that validated every design decision and every tactical doctrine developed to employ it. Corsair squadrons operating from carriers and island bases had collectively shot down over 2,000 Japanese aircraft while suffering losses that gave them kill ratios exceeding 10-to-1 throughout the Pacific theater. The aircraft that Japanese intelligence had dismissed as another example of American industrial muscle compensating for design inadequacy had proven to be arguably the finest fighter aircraft produced by any nation during World War II, combining speed, climb rate, firepower, and ruggedness in proportions that made it effective in every role from fleet defense to ground attack. It would remain in production through the end of the war and beyond, serving in Korea and with foreign air forces into the 1960s, a service life that testified to the fundamental soundness of its design. Mitchell survived the war with 22 confirmed kills, making her one of the highest-scoring American fighter pilots of the war, though her name would never appear in official records and her achievements would remain classified for decades after the war ended. She returned to Iowa in 1946, married a farmer who had served in the Army in Europe,
raised 3 children, and never spoke about her combat service except to other veterans who understood what she had experienced. She attended reunions of her squadron, where aging men who had once been young warriors shared memories of combat and mourned friends who had not returned. And she was accepted as an equal by pilots who had once doubted whether a woman could handle a fighter in combat.
She died in 2003 at age 82, and at her funeral, her eldest son read from her wartime letters home, carefully preserved by her mother. Letters that described in understated language the fear and exhilaration of combat, the pride she felt in serving her country, and the hope that her generation's sacrifices would create a world where such sacrifices would never again be necessary. The broader lesson of the Corsair's success and Japanese intelligence failures to anticipate it remains relevant decades after the war ended. Nations that dismiss enemy technological capabilities based on racist assumptions or past performance make strategic errors that can prove catastrophic when those enemies solve their technical problems and exploit industrial advantages. Japanese planners convinced themselves that American aircraft were inferior and would remain so because they wanted to believe it, because acknowledging American technical equality or superiority would have required rethinking fundamental strategic assumptions about Japan's ability to wage war successfully against American industrial might. The American submarine campaign that strangled Japan's economy might have been countered if Japanese naval planners had allocated resources to anti-submarine warfare instead of to battleships and fleet carriers. But such allocation would have required accepting that Americans could produce effective weapons even when those weapons initially failed in combat. The destruction of Japanese merchant shipping by American submarines using torpedoes that initially were defective but were systematically corrected through engineering effort demonstrated that initial failures were not permanent indicators of technical inferiority, but rather problems that American industry could and would solve. Similarly, the transformation of American aviation from the dark days of 1942, when Zeros dominated Pacific skies, to the overwhelming superiority of 1944, when Corsairs and Hellcats achieved kill ratios that made Japanese air operations suicidal, demonstrated that nations with sufficient industrial capacity and engineering talent can overcome initial technical disadvantages and produce weapon systems that are not merely adequate but superior. The Corsair represented American aviation at its finest, an aircraft designed without compromise to achieve maximum performance, produced in thousands by an industrial base that Japanese factories could not match, and employed by pilots whose training, while perhaps not as elite as pre-war Japanese training, was nonetheless adequate to exploit the aircraft's capabilities. The bent-wing fighter that Japanese intelligence had failed to take seriously until it was destroying Japanese aircraft in combat became the symbol of American air power and a reminder that dismissing enemy capabilities based on early performance or racist assumptions leads to strategic surprises that can prove decisive in warfare. The whistling death that Japanese pilots learned to fear represented not just one aircraft, but an entire industrial and military system that had overcome its early failures and was producing weapons and warriors in combinations that Japan could not counter and could not escape. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.